For 6 years, I silently paid my parents' mortgage while they praised my sister's imaginary success. At dinner, my mother called me a failure. I felt a lifetime of resentment freeze into a calm smile and asked, "Then who will repay the $80,000 I spent saving you?" My name is Barbara, and tonight, the carefully curated lie my family has lived for decades finally shattered. It happened over a roast chicken dinner. Under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier my mother insisted was a family heirloom. My sister, Brenda, was holding court, her laughter echoing as she described the sheer artistic integrity of her latest off-Broadway play. My mother, Dorothy, watched her with an adoring gaze that I hadn't felt directed at me since I was a child. Then, her eyes shifted to me. Her voice, laced with a familiar, sweet venom, dripped across the table. "At least Brenda is creating something beautiful for the world. What have you ever created, Barbara, besides those soulless spreadsheets?" The air crackled. My father, Richard, shifted uncomfortably. My uncle Arthur looked down at his plate. Brenda just smiled, a queen accepting her tribute. That was it, the final cut after a lifetime of 1,000 tiny ones. In the dead silence that followed, I found my voice. I placed my fork down, the silver clinking softly against the porcelain. My gaze met my mother's, unwavering. "For starters," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I created the $80,000 that saved this house from foreclosure 6 years ago." I think that's a pretty good start. The shock on their faces was just the beginning of the story, and if you've ever felt the sting of being utterly invisible in your own family, hit that like button and stick with me as we unravel this. Before that $80,000 truth bomb detonated, there was a lifetime of carefully constructed fiction. Our family, the Millers of Shaker Heights, Ohio, was built on the legacy of Miller and Son printers. My father, Richard, inherited it from his father, and it was his entire identity. My mother, Dorothy, played the part of the proud matriarch, her social standing tied directly to the business's success and our pristine colonial-style home. From a young age, our roles were cast. Brenda was the star, the radiant, dramatic one who would put on little shows for the employees in the break room. I was the reliable one, the quiet backbone. While Brenda captivated her audience, I was in my father's office, fascinated by the clean logic of the ledgers. At 10 years old, I was already balancing accounts receivable. He'd pat my head and call me his little adding machine. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a job description. I was useful, dependable, and completely out of the spotlight. Brenda got applause. I got quiet approval for a job well done. It was a dynamic that became the blueprint for our entire lives. She was the art, and I was the infrastructure that held everything up, silent and unseen. It's a strange feeling, being the pillar everyone leans on but no one ever sees. If you know what that's like, just type the city you're watching from in the comments. Let's see how far this silent strength reaches. The stark difference in how my parents valued us was never clearer than when it came time for college. I graduated top of my class, earning a full academic scholarship to study finance at Ohio State University. It was practical, it was prestigious, and most importantly, it cost my parents nothing. Brenda, with her B- average but a flair for dramatic monologues, was accepted into a costly acting conservatory in New York City. The tuition alone was more than my father's annual profit. I remember the night he told me how they were going to pay for it. We were in his study, the smell of old paper and ink thick in the air. He couldn't look me in the eye. "We're selling the Heidelberg Press," he announced. The Heidelberg was the heart of the business, a magnificent piece of German engineering that had been my grandfather's pride and joy. It was a tangible piece of our family's legacy. He sold it to fund Brenda's dream. "An investment in talent is the wisest investment of all, Barb," he explained, as if quoting a line from a bad play. All the while, both my parents spoke glowingly of the $2 million estate they would one day leave us, a fantasy built on the inflated value of a business whose heart they had just sold off. My full ride was met with a simple nod. Brenda's tuition was funded by dismantling our heritage. The message was clear. My achievements saved them money, but her dreams were worth mortgaging our future for. The fantasy of that $2 million estate began to unravel the moment my father retired. He prided himself on being a savvy businessman, But in reality, he was a printer, not an investor. Freed from the daily grind of the press, he dove into the stock market with the reckless confidence of an amateur. He made a series of disastrous investments, chasing high-risk tech stocks and speculative ventures. Within 2 years, my parents' comfortable retirement fund had evaporated. Compounding the disaster was my mother's absolute refusal to adjust their lifestyle. Selling their grand home in Shaker Heights was unthinkable. What would the neighbors say? What would her garden club think? Maintaining appearances was paramount, even if it meant sinking into a chasm of debt. I discovered the horrifying extent of their troubles during a visit for Thanksgiving. I was looking for a photo album in my father's study when a sheaf of papers slipped out from behind a bookshelf. It was an official letter from the bank, cold and clinical, with the words "Notice of Foreclosure" stamped in red at the top. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments. My blood ran cold. That night, while they slept, I sat at their kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I transferred $10,000 from my savings to their account, enough to halt the immediate proceedings. A month later, I set up the automatic monthly payment. Over 6 years, between the mortgage, soaring property taxes, and emergency repairs, the total climbed to just over $80,000. It's a heavy burden, carrying a secret that protects the very people who would never guess you were strong enough to carry it. Type savior if you were always the family fixer, the one who cleaned up the messes no one else would acknowledge. The most bitter irony of my silent support was the narrative my mother began to weave. With the immediate threat of foreclosure gone and a steady, mysterious influx of cash stabilizing their finances, Dorothy needed an explanation that fit her worldview. A story where her responsible, spreadsheet-loving daughter was the savior just didn't have the right flair. So, she invented one. At family gatherings and bridge games, a new myth was born. Brenda, our shining star in New York, was supporting them. According to my mother, Brenda's lucrative commercial work and connections with wealthy artists were keeping them afloat. Every home repair, every new appliance, every holiday gift was attributed to Brenda's generosity. I remember sitting at a Christmas dinner, listening to my mother tell my aunt, "We're just so blessed. Brenda's success has been a godsend. She makes sure we're taken care of." I nearly choked on my wine. Brenda, who I knew for a fact was struggling to pay her rent in a tiny Brooklyn apartment, just smiled and accepted the praise. She never explicitly confirmed it, but she never denied it either. She bathed in the unearned glory. For 6 years, I watched this fiction play out. My sacrifice, my hard-earned money, my careful financial planning, it was all laundered into a more palatable story, one that fed my mother's ego and polished my sister's crown. Each word of praise for Brenda was a sharp, painful erasure of me. The catalyst for the explosion was, fittingly, another celebration of Brenda's imagined success. An email arrived from my mother, the subject line a string of star emojis. "Our star shines bright. Celebration dinner Saturday." Brenda had landed a small, non-speaking role in an off-Broadway play, a production so obscure it barely had a website. However, a local blogger had mentioned her name in a single sentence of a rambling review, and to my mother, this was tantamount to a Tony nomination. The dinner was mandatory. "Be here by 6 p.m., the email commanded, with no consideration for the fact that I lived 3 hours away in Chicago, or that it was the end of a brutal fiscal quarter for my company. Still, I went. Duty, habit, and a sliver of foolish hope that things might be different this time compelled me to make the drive. As I pulled into their immaculate Shaker Heights neighborhood, a familiar dread settled in my stomach. The house was blazing with light, cars of relatives and my parents' friends lining the curved driveway. I had to park down the street, walking the last 100 yards in the crisp Ohio autumn air. As I approached, I could hear the sound of laughter and my sister's theatrical voice floating through the open windows. I was walking into the heart of the fiction they had all agreed to believe, the stage for a play where I was, as always, the invisible stagehand. Before the guests arrived, I found my father alone in his study, staring at a piece of paper under his desk lamp. The harsh light carved deep lines of stress into his forehead. It was an estimate for a roof repair, totaling nearly $5,000. I could see the panic in the set of his shoulders. This was my opening, a chance to offer a real solution, not just a secret Band-Aid. "Dad." I began softly. I saw the estimate. I know things are tight. Instead of just helping out, let me do what I actually do for a living. Let me take a look at your investment portfolio, what's left of it. We can restructure things, find ways to generate more stable income without selling the house. There are options. For a moment, I thought he was considering it. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a weary helplessness. But then, pride, stubborn and fierce, slammed a door shut. His face hardened. I don't need my daughter to teach me how to manage my own money. He snapped, his voice low and sharp. I built a business from the ground up with my own two hands. Just then, my mother swept into the room, a bottle of champagne in hand. Richard, Arthur is here. She chirped, before noticing the tension. She glanced at the estimate, then at me, her expression turning icy. Barbara, don't you dare bring your cold, calculating business into this house. Tonight is a happy occasion. It's for Brenda. It's a special kind of pain when you offer a lifeline and they slap your hand away. If you've ever offered a real solution only to be shut down by pride, I want you to share this story. Let's reach the people who need to hear they're not alone. As the guests settled around the grand dining table, the series of small, stinging cuts began. Each one was a reminder of my designated place in the family's ecosystem. Dorothy started, bringing out the appetizers. Barbara, your flight from Chicago must have been tiring. You look a little washed out, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, before turning to Brenda. Brenda, darling, the New York air obviously agrees with you. You're simply glowing. Later, when I mentioned I had just closed a major merger for my firm and was being promoted to chief financial officer, my mother simply smiled thinly and said, "Oh, that's nice, dear. More numbers, I suppose." A moment later, she made a grand announcement that Brenda's play might be extending its run by another weekend, an event treated with the gravity of a royal decree. The main course was served, and my father unveiled the gift they had bought for Brenda. It was a beautiful, vintage designer handbag, something she'd pointed out in a magazine. "A little something to celebrate your hard work paying off," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I stared at my plate, my food tasting like ash. I knew for a fact that the extra $1,000 I had sent them the month before, money I'd earmarked for my own IRA contribution, was what paid for that bag. My hard work was literally in her hands, being celebrated as a testament to hers. Each polite smile, each nod of agreement, felt like a betrayal of myself. My Uncle Arthur, my father's younger brother, was a man who had built his own successful logistics company from scratch. He was practical, direct, and had no patience for nonsense. He had been listening quietly to the endless praise for Brenda, a thoughtful, almost skeptical expression on his face. Finally, during a lull in the conversation, he set down his wine glass and turned to Brenda, his voice calm and reasonable. "Brenda, I've got to say, I'm truly impressed," he began. "You know I run a business. I know what things cost. With the rent in a city like New York, plus the general instability of an acting career, I'm just curious. How do you manage to support that lifestyle and still have enough left over to help your parents out so significantly? You must be a financial wizard." The question hung in the air, sharp and logical. A silence fell over the table. Brenda's confident smile faltered. She blinked, laughed a little too loudly, and said something vague about smart budgeting and lucrative commercial gigs. Before she could stumble further, my mother jumped in. "Oh, Arthur, you know artists think differently about money. Brenda has a wonderful, creative approach to finances." My father added, "She's always been resourceful. Very resourceful." The excuses were so flimsy, so transparent, it was almost painful to watch. The perfect narrative had just been punctured by a single, logical question. For the first time all night, I saw a crack in the facade. There's a certain power in one person daring to ask the question everyone else is afraid to. Let me know, were you ever the truth teller in your family? Type truth in the comments if you were the one who dared to point out that the emperor had no clothes. I want to see how many of us are out there. The rest of the dinner was tense. Uncle Arthur's question had unsettled the delicate balance of our family's fantasy. Brenda, now on the defensive, began to overcompensate. She talked about the grueling nature of her art, the emotional toll of auditions, and the sacrifices she made. The subtext was clear. She was a martyr for her craft, and by extension, for the family. The conversation devolved into a familiar pattern. Brenda's struggles were noble and profound, while my entire career, my life, was reduced to a stable, boring necessity. Feeling emboldened and perhaps a bit desperate to regain control of the narrative, Brenda turned to me. "Honestly, Barb," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "you should really try to live a little. All you do is work. You have no idea what it's like to struggle for something you're passionate about." Before I could even respond, my mother seized the moment to deliver the final, killing blow. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt that she had perfected over 30 years. Her voice was low, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "At least Brenda is creating something beautiful for the world. What have you ever created, Barbara, besides those soulless spreadsheets?" And there it was. The ultimate dismissal. My entire existence, my education, my career, my sacrifices, the very financial stability that was keeping a roof over her head was reduced to a meaningless, soulless piece of paper. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of my worthlessness in their eyes. That was the last straw. The point of no return. A strange calm washed over me. For years, I had imagined this moment, and in my mind, it was always filled with tears and shouting. But in reality, there was only a profound, chilling clarity. The complex web of resentment, hurt, and obligation simplified into a single, hard truth. I gently placed my knife and fork on my plate, the metallic sound echoing in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the room. My mother stared at me, expecting an argument or perhaps tears. She got neither. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I felt no need for her approval. "For starters," I said, my voice unnervingly steady, almost conversational, "I created the $80,000 that saved this house from foreclosure 6 years ago. I think that's a pretty good start." The shockwave was instantaneous and silent. My father's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. Brenda's jaw dropped. My mother's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing with no sound. What nonsense are you talking about?" she finally stammered. I didn't answer her. Instead, I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. I navigated to the history of transfers to my father's account. Then, I leaned across the table and handed the phone not to my parents, but to my Uncle Arthur. "Uncle Arthur," I said quietly, "you're a man who understands ledgers. 6 years of monthly transfers, plus extra for emergencies. The numbers don't lie." He took the phone, and as he scrolled, I watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a deep, damning understanding. There is a terrifying and beautiful power in finally laying down the receipts. If you've ever had to bring the undeniable truth to the table, even when your hands were shaking, this space is for you. Subscribe and join a community of people who know that sometimes the quietest voice holds the most powerful facts. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. All eyes were on my Uncle Arthur as he handed the phone back to me, his gaze fixed on his brother. "Richard?" he asked, his voice low and laced with a disappointment that was sharper than any anger could have been. My father, Richard, seemed to shrink in his chair. He couldn't meet his brother's eyes. He couldn't meet mine. He stared at his half-eaten chicken as if it held the answers to his life's failings. "It's true," he mumbled, the words barely audible. "Barb, she's been helping us." The admission, quiet as it was, shattered everything. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, looking back and forth between me and our parents. "Helping?" I thought. "You said you were fine. You told me I was helping." Her voice cracked with a mixture of confusion and humiliation. My mother finally found her voice, but it was laced with venomous denial. "This is absurd. She's making it up to ruin Brenda's night. She's always been jealous." But her words were hollow, robbed of their power by my father's confession. The beautiful, carefully constructed play of the perfect Miller family, with its rising star and its benevolent patriarch, had just collapsed into a pile of lies right there on the dining room table. The guests, my parents' friends, began to murmur uncomfortably, averting their eyes. The fantasy was over. The stage was wrecked. And we were all just standing there, in the harsh, unflattering glare of the truth. After the guests made their hasty, awkward exits and Brenda had stormed out of the house, a grim silence fell upon the four of us left at the table. My mother was silently stacking plates with trembling hands, refusing to look at anyone. My father just sat there, a hollowed-out version of the proud man he once was. But my Uncle Arthur wasn't finished. He looked at his brother, his expression devoid of pity. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Richard?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of disappointment. "You inherited a $5 million legacy, a respected name in this town, and you drove it into the ground. You burned through your retirement, nearly lost this house, and let one daughter secretly pay for your mistakes while you publicly shamed her. This isn't just bad finance, it's a moral failure." My mother started to protest, but I held up a hand, and for the first time, she fell silent. My voice was different now. It wasn't the voice of their daughter, it was the voice of a CFO taking control of a failing asset. "The secret payments stop tonight," I announced. "Effective immediately, I am taking over your finances. I will draft a formal loan agreement for the $80,000 with a nominal interest rate. I will need full access to all of your accounts, and I will be putting you on a strict, non-negotiable budget. The fiction is over. The financial reckoning begins now." The look of utter shock on my parents' faces was profound. They had just been subjected to a hostile takeover right at their own dining room table. There comes a moment when keeping the peace is no longer an option, and you have to become the one who draws the hard lines. If you've ever had to take control to save your family, or even just to save yourself, tell me about it. Type takeover in the comments if you know that feeling of stepping up when no one else would. The weeks that followed were brutal. Taking control of my parents' finances was like untangling a decade's worth of knotted, frayed wires. There were hidden credit card debts, unpaid property taxes I hadn't known about, and a second mortgage on the house that my father had taken out in desperation. The reality was far worse than the $80,000 I had poured in. True to my word, I established firm boundaries. The first family therapy session was a disaster of accusations and tears. My mother accused me of humiliating her, of wielding money like a weapon. My father was too deep in his shame to contribute much at all. Brenda, who eventually agreed to join via video call from New York, was caught between her own sense of betrayal and a lifetime of being the favored child. But I held my ground. I stopped the automatic transfers, replacing them with a structured payment plan for their essential bills, which I managed directly. When my mother wanted to buy a new set of patio furniture, I emailed her a copy of the budget we had agreed upon and said no. When Brenda asked for money to cover an acting workshop, I told her that our parents were no longer in a position to fund her career. It was painful, forcing them to live in the reality they had so long avoided. There were slammed phones and tearful arguments, but for the first time, our family was operating on a foundation of truth, however harsh. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival and forcing a necessary, agonizing rebirth. Slowly, painfully, something began to shift. Deprived of the financial fiction they had been living, my family had no choice but to confront their new reality. The therapy sessions, once a battlefield, became quieter, more reflective. My father, stripped of his pride, started taking on a part-time consulting job at a local print shop, finding a sliver of his old self in the familiar smell of ink and paper. My mother, forced to adhere to a budget, discovered a talent for refinishing old furniture she found at thrift stores, turning a necessity into a passion. The most surprising change was in Brenda. Without the silent pressure of being the family's imagined savior, she seemed lighter. She admitted that the life of a struggling actress in New York was lonely and crushing. A few months after the dinner, she made the difficult decision to move back to Ohio. She got a job teaching drama at a local high school, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unforced joy in her. She was brilliant at it, nurturing young talent with a passion that was more real than any off-Broadway role. The culmination of this new beginning came on my father's birthday. It was a simple gathering, a potluck at their house. At the end of the night, my father handed me a large manila envelope. Inside was his revised will. He had made me the sole executor. "You are always the one who knew the true value of things," "Barb," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have seen it sooner. It wasn't an apology in words, but in action. It was the ultimate acknowledgement, a transfer of trust that was worth more than any amount of money. Tonight, 6 months after that fateful dinner, I'm sitting on my parents' back porch, watching the fireflies dance in the humid Ohio air. The new patio furniture my mother so desperately wanted is here, but she bought it with the money she earned from selling her refinished pieces, and she tells everyone the story with pride. Brenda is here, laughing about a funny moment from her drama class, her face more animated and at peace than I've ever seen it. My father is quietly discussing his retirement account with me, asking for my actual advice, and listening when I give it. The change is not miraculous. It's methodical, built day by day on a foundation of difficult truths. We learned that family isn't about maintaining a perfect picture for the world to see. True family is about showing up for the messy, complicated, and sometimes ugly reality. It's about accountability. My $80,000 didn't just save a house, it purchased a truth that set us all free. It was the price of admission to an authentic life. Justice, I found, isn't always a loud, dramatic victory. Sometimes, it's the quiet, steady work of rebuilding on solid ground. And forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about accepting it and choosing to write a different future together. The most important lesson was realizing that my value was never determined by their recognition. It was always there, in my work, in my integrity, in my quiet strength. The revenge wasn't in their downfall, but in my own rise to unapologetically claim my worth. The world may never know the silent battles we fight for our families, but if this story has touched that part of you that has given everything and asked for nothing, know that you are seen. Subscribe if these stories speak your truth, and join a community that understands that the most powerful legacies are built on honesty, not appearances.